I've been working in bars and pubs since I left school. I was only supposed to be a year at most, earning a wage while I figured out just what I wanted to do with my life. But before I knew it, just 1 year became 2, then 3 once I had secured a position as supervisor in a local pub. Being a bartender is hard, but it is never boring. Busy shifts generally means lots of laughs and lots of tips. So, as much as you get mobbed on the weekends, it never feels too overwhelming, especially when your favorite regular buys you Jaeger shots when the boss isn't looking. However, there is one date on the calendar that every bartender all over the world has come to dread. That date is March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. Now, where I live, St. Patrick's Day means everyone, and I mean everyone, no matter their background or identity, suddenly pretends they're Irish. From the Kiss Me I'm Irish shirts that sell by the truckload, to the fake ginger beads and 4-leaf clover hats that plaster the bar's floor once the night is over. St. Paddy's Day always seems to bring out the wilder side of the local population. This is only exacerbated by the number of actual Irish people who get a ferry over for a few days to celebrate the holiday among foreigners. Those guys don't mess around. We open the pub at 10 in the morning to start serving breakfast and lunch, and there is always a bevy of Irishmen waiting outside, having already sank a few pints in hotel bars before they arrive. This really does add a feeling of chaos to the proceedings, and I'm not sure if it's the English sense of competition, but people genuinely do try to outdrink the Irish on their own national holiday. A foolish endeavor if ever there was one. This can lead to some pretty horrendous working conditions, and sometimes the number of times you end up mopping up vomit ticks over into the double digits. Gross, I know, but manageable. What wasn't manageable for me anyway was a visit our pub received from a man a few Paddy's days ago, one that I don't think I'll ever forget. So one of the things that strikes you about the Paddy's Day crowd is how they're all basically wearing the same thing. I have previously mentioned all the tacky souvenir-type items revelers can get their hands on, but maybe not the ridiculous proliferation of said items. Companies like Guinness, in a bid to sell as much of the black stuff as they possibly can, flood entire cities with merchandise that is often given to drinkers for free. So picture a scene where 99 people out of 100 have green-branded Guinness t-shirts on. Most are wearing those dumb leprechaun hats, those ginger beards, and some are even wearing extremely creepy-looking leprechaun masks. Starting to get the picture here? Everyone looks alike, which can make bartending particularly difficult, not to mention how difficult it is to remember who's ordered what drink. So at one point I'm pulling up pints when this one fella in a mask steps up. I ask him what he's after, and he says something unintelligible through his leprechaun mask. Now, I'm sick to the back teeth of asking people to take their masks off so I can make out their orders, so I may have been a bit rude when I asked him to take off that daft mask. He just shakes his head, asks me to lean closer, then orders a pint of Guinness in a distinctly English accent. Something you need to know about Guinness in particular: you don't just pour a pint of Guinness and whack it down in front of a customer. You have to pour about 2/3 of the thick black fluid into the glass, then leave it to settle before topping it with the rest of the Guinness. That way, you end up with a perfectly balanced pint of stout that's as creamy as it is malty. So that's exactly what I do. I pour the dude's drink, then leave it to settle, just like I'd done 1,000 times before, only to find the masked man almost violently waving at me. I asked him what was wrong, and he starts complaining that I'd only half poured his bloody drink, and that I was to bring it to him immediately. I laugh a wee bit, then start giving him the talk about how you need to let it settle before serving blah blah blah. He then accuses me of taking the piss out of him, and starts kicking off about how I'm looking for a fight with him and all this other nonsense. At that point, I cut him off. We can't have anyone like that in our pub, and they're only ever out to cause trouble, and giving them alcohol just makes that kind of situation 100 times worse. So I put on my polite professional voice, calling him sir and all of that, and gently explain why he can go jump in a lake. Not my exact words, but you get the idea. That's when he just comes out with, "I'm gonna effing kill you." I was taken aback by this, and I remember just leaning back with a look of confusion like, "What did you say to me, fella?" He repeats that he's going to wait outside until we close, wait for me to leave, and then kill me. He said he didn't live far, and that he could go back and fetch a kitchen knife in less than 10 minutes. I've had threats like this before, and yeah, they're grim, but it's always from a guy who's coked up and raving. 9 times out of 10, they don't even remember you the next day, and the drunk that was threatening to smash your face in will try and make casual conversation about the footy, as they'd never even met you. But this guy was calm as anything. He just gently and slowly explained how he was going to kill me, and it didn't matter if he was arrested or caught on CCTV because I'd be dead, just like I deserved. I'm not even afraid to admit that I was actually seriously freaked out at this point. I reached forward, trying to pull the mask off that concealed his identity from me, but he dodged, waving as he walked away from the bar and disappeared into the crowds. And I do mean disappeared. I spent the next 15 minutes or so wandering around the horseshoe-shaped bar trying to figure out where this fellow had gone, but I couldn't see him. There was every chance he was just tucked away in a corner somewhere, whining to his mates about how the bartender is a bellend or whatever, but it seemed just as likely that this guy really had gone back to his flat to get a weapon and that he was just using the chaos of the day itself to his advantage. By the end of the shift, I was emotionally exhausted. Every time I saw one of those daft leprechaun masks, I couldn't keep my eyes off of it. Every single one could have been that lad coming back to stab me to death in my own bloody workplace. I know it all seems crazy in retrospect, that he was obviously just full of bluster. But every murder story seems ridiculous until it's plastered all over the newspapers. With all those people coming out of the woodwork to say, "Oh, we never saw it coming, and it was just so unexpected." But a part of me really did think it was going to be my face on the newspapers the next day. And sometimes I actually thank the man upstairs for keeping me safe that night. It is March 17th, 2019, St. Patrick's Day. In Cookstown, County Tyrone, 17-year-old Lauren Bollock is getting ready to go to a party. She and her group of friends had spent their entire school day in increasing levels of excitement, swapping ideas on what to wear, exchanging rumors on who would and wouldn't be attending, and most importantly, scheming on how to get their hands on the most quintessential of St. Patrick's Day's amenities: booze. No Paddy's Day party is complete without an unhealthy quantity of the demon drink, as any self-respecting Irishman will tell you. And as for the underage Lauren, buying alcohol would be as easy as putting on a little extra makeup and standing on her tippy toes at the counter. After all, without the telltale school tie, very little separates the appearance of a student and a fledgling office worker. Lauren and her friends finished their studies for the day before congregating in one of their parents' houses to prepare for the night's festivities. Outfits were road-tested, makeup applied, and the girls even sampled a little of their alcohol haul to get healthy pre-drunk before they departed. When the time came, they piled into a waiting taxicab which drove them a few miles down the road to the Greenvale Hotel. The sight that greeted them was one of utter chaos. The Greenvale Hotel on the outskirts of Cookstown had decided to throw a Paddy's Day dry disco for the local youths. Underage drinking is a huge problem in the UK in general, let alone in Northern Ireland, where alcohol is seen as a staunch tradition, even a rite of passage. If parents knew where their children were on one of the rowdiest nights of the year, it belayed their fears, even if they understood how inevitable it was that someone would get their hands on alcohol. The popularity of such an event would be evident to Lauren and her friends upon their arrival at the Greenvale, for outside a venue that had a maximum capacity of just 100 or so, at least 500 to 600 excitable Irish young people had assembled and were waiting to be allowed inside. Such a raucous scene might have been off-putting to another group of girls, but not Lauren and her friends. They found the huge gathering of their peers to be intensely exciting and attractive. Rural Ireland can be an extremely tedious place to live for a young person, lacking in all the adventure and attractions of the big city. So any opportunity to mingle with a large group of their peers outside of school hours is something very few Irish teenagers can pass up. Lauren and her friends climbed out of the taxi into a cold and windy evening to socialize with old friends and make a few new ones in the process. Meanwhile, inside the Greenvale Hotel, the management team is in a quandary. They knew all too well that there was far too many youths outside, and that not all of them could be let into the venue. However, St. Patrick's Day was a serious earner for the hotel. After a traditionally quiet January and February, where hedonists eschew the good life in favor of gym memberships and detox regimens, Paddy's Day always kick-started the local economy in a big way. To limit their patrons during such an event would surely be inviting financial ruin, but something had to be done to avoid disappointing more than half of the young people gathered outside. The general manager of the venue made the decision to go outside to address the waiting revelers. He told them in no certain terms that the Greenvale simply did not have the facilities to accommodate so many of them, and some would have to go home disappointed. He then asked the waiting youths to form an orderly queue at the entrance, where staff would take their entrance fee and stamp their hands with black ink to verify them. And that's when things started to go wrong. As I've previously mentioned, a long-standing tradition in the UK and elsewhere is to imbibe alcohol before arrival at a pub, club, or party, in order to get a head start and save a little money. The same applied to the gathering of underage youths outside the Greenvale that night. So instead of doing as they were asked and forming an orderly queue at the entranceway, what started fairly calmly had soon descended into a chaotic mess of shoving, shouting, and fighting. Hotel staff pleaded with the drunken crowds to calm themselves, but their cries were barely heard over the throngs of barking teenagers, some of who had begun to shove their peers towards the waiting line. Lauren was one of those who had rushed to queue up first and began to feel herself being trapped against one of the Greenvale's outer walls. She tried to push back, to give herself a little personal space, but it was impossible. No matter how hard she and her friends shoved back, the crowd didn't seem to disperse or diffuse. It wasn't long before neither Lauren nor her friends could move. Their arms were trapped by their sides, their bodies squeezed and compressed until some began to complain of feeling faint. Lauren was being crushed against the brick wall, finding harder and harder to breathe as the crowds formed tighter and tighter around her. At one point, she saw a young man with glasses, so pale he was almost white as a sheet, collapse from the lack of oxygen available to him. This was barely noticed by the pushing crowds, who simply walked over and stepped on the unconscious boy, crushing him to death beneath their feet with nothing else in their minds but the desire to drink, dance, and flirt. With the very last of her strength, Lauren began to shout and yell. "My friends are on the ground, move back! My friends have fainted, move back! My friends can't breathe, move back!" Nothing. Not one bit of movement or compassion. In fact, one of the last things Lauren saw before she passed out was the sight of laughing, spotted-faced teenage boys amusing themselves by pushing the crowds towards the doors, trying to get them inside so they too could get to drinking. A horrific sight to see in the moments before unconsciousness, but Lauren wouldn't just be rendered unconscious. The crush at the Greenvale Hotel that night went on for another half an hour. By the time the crowd realized what was happening, it was far too late. Lauren, along with several other teenagers, had been suffocated in the crush. Nigel Rudell, the medical director of North Ireland's ambulance service, told the BBC that emergency crews who responded to a 999 call shortly before 9:30 p.m. encountered upsetting scenes. At this stage, everything points towards it being a tragic accident, and our hearts absolutely go out to the families of those involved and everybody who was caught up in this incident last night, he said. Yet the tragedy seemed to have been painted by the media as a seemingly unavoidable one, an incident as sudden and shocking as a terror attack or natural disaster. But there was nothing natural about the deaths at the Greenvale Hotel that night, as they had been entirely avoidable. The facts remained that poor planning, drug use, and youthful zeal had proved a deadly cocktail. And without admitting this to ourselves, the Greenvale Hotel crush is doomed to happen again, and again, and again. I didn't know much about St. Patrick's Day when I first moved to America. I was familiar with American culture, sure, and growing up in Hokkaido in Japan, I was vaguely aware that St. Patrick's Day existed, but I had no idea it was taken so seriously by Irish Americans. So my first March 17th as a student at Boston University was certainly an eye-opener. I remember waking up that morning like it was any other. I threw on some clothes, ate a small breakfast, then headed down to Boston Common to catch the T to the university library. It was only then that I saw just how enthusiastic Boston was over St. Patrick's Day. Almost everyone I saw had some item of green clothing. Even smartly dressed businessmen had little green pocket squares or four-leaf clover pins. I saw big groups of kilted men with those noisy bag things, and even people dressed as small red-haired creatures, though I can't remember the word for them. Yet I could barely believe my eyes when I saw the Charles River. Somehow, some way, the city had managed to dye to entirely a bright green. Everything seemed to be bigger and louder in America, unlike Japan, where we almost pride ourselves on not showing too much emotion. I was reflecting on this for a moment as the T stopped and looked on some more passengers, but as one man embarked the train, he immediately locked eyes with me. I said a silent prayer that he would leave me alone, but it was wishful thinking. He had already given me the kind of look that many girls dread, the kind of look a cat might give a wounded mouse. Then, to my ultimate disappointment, he sat down next to me. He reeked of alcohol, so much so that I had to subtly cover my nose to keep from feeling nauseous. I didn't drink alcohol back then, and I still rarely do. The smell still makes me feel sickly even to this day, so I simply put my earphones in and tried to keep to myself as the tea started moving again. A few minutes went by and I felt the man turning towards me, before the muffled sound of him saying something to me could be heard through my earbuds. I tried to ignore him as best I could, but the man began to poke me in the arm to get my attention. I couldn't ignore him anymore, so I took out my earphones and I asked him if I could help him in any way. "Why aren't you wearing green?" he asked me, slurring his words as he did so. At first, I had no idea what he was talking about, but I quickly remembered that wearing green clothing seemed to be a sort of tradition among locals on this particular date. Yet still, I didn't wish to engage with the man, so I might have lied just a little to get him to back off. I don't speak, so much, English," I said, pretending to be ignorant. I thought this might deter the man. It wasn't the first time I'd pretended not to speak English to avoid a man's attentions, and usually it worked. Just not this time. "Why aren't you wearing green?" He spoke much louder now, punctuating his final word by grabbing the sleeve of his own green pullover and waving it in my face. As he leaned in, another wave of his alcohol-soaked breath wafted into my nostrils. I couldn't bring myself to answer him. I thought if I tried to speak, I might vomit up my breakfast. So I simply shrugged at him as if I didn't understand and then tried to go back to my phone. That's when I felt an intense pain on my left arm. I cried out, shifting in my seat and turning to see that drunk man had actually pinched me. He was laughing as he did it too, with a little drool catching on his bottom lip before running down his chin. "You don't wear green, you get pinched," he said, still giggling to himself. Other people in the tea began to notice now, some looking pretty outraged that this drunk man was treating me this way. "Please don't," I managed to say, holding the part of my arm where the man had pinched me. But this only seemed to make him angry. By the time I had jumped up from the seat to move away from him, other passengers on the train were angrily shouting at the man to leave me alone. People in Boston are very friendly, especially to foreigners like me, and as I got off the train a few stops early, I decided not to let this experience tarnish the city's image in my eyes. After a long day of studying, I was headed back to my apartment in an Uber taxi when I got a text from a few friends. They told me they were having a few drinks in a big Irish bar near Government Center. I forgot the name, but they asked if I would like to join them for some green beer. I had never heard of green beer, but they insisted this was a big tradition in America. I was not entirely in the mood for drinking, but I did like the idea of seeing some of the party, especially since it only happened once a year. If the beer in the river were green, what else had Boston changed the color of? I had to find out. So, I arrived back at my apartment, rushing upstairs to take a shower and change my clothes. This time I tried to find something green to wear, only to find that I didn't actually own anything distinctly green. I had a turquoise t-shirt, but that was about as green as it got. I texted my friend again, but she reassured me I could borrow the green scrunchie she had in her wrist. That way I could be safe from more pinching men, hopefully. But as I began to walk around to the Irish bar, that was no more than 5 or 10 minutes walk from my apartment, I happened to walk by a tea station. Standing outside was the last person I ever wanted to see. It was the drunk man from that morning, with a brown paper bag in his hand. He'd obviously been drinking since that very early morning, and he looked even worse than he did on the train. I hoped he would be too drunk to see me or even recognize me, but to my complete and utter horror, I saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. He shouted after me, and I tried to walk faster to avoid him, but it was impossible. His rude, racist shouts became even louder, and he started to run after me. I had tears in my eyes as I ran down the sidewalk away from him. I ran to the first police officer I saw, bursting into tears as I fell into his arms. I tried to explain what was going on, but I was panicking a lot, and then I turned to point at the man who was following me. There was no one there, only happy, friendly partygoers. No sign of the drunk. The policeman walked me back to my apartment. He was very friendly and understanding, especially since I was so upset that my English had failed me. Most people in Boston are very nice and friendly, as I said, but some not so much. Especially when alcohol is involved, I sometimes think the world would be very different if people didn't drink. Some living arrangements can be unusual, to say the least, and renting on-site at a storage facility is very, very different than living in a regular apartment. My uncommon living area connects to the storage facility by a long, dark, cold hallway from a door in what we call our porch area, and every night I have to walk past this doorway to get into my apartment. When my wife and I go to bed at the same time, I don't notice it, but when she goes to sleep before me and the house is dark and quiet, an acute anxiety grips me as I quickly patter down the hallway to my bedroom. Something about that doorway to the storage facility feels ominous, always has. A small peephole is in the door, and sometimes I imagine looking through it at night only to see something or someone in the hallway on the other side. One night last year, in the weeks leading up to St. Patrick's Day, strange events began to unfold. At first, we didn't notice anything too weird, mainly because the place's customers are in and out of the facility at all hours of the day and night. Not to mention the fact that they can turn out to be some pretty strange folks when all is said and done. Anyway, at first, it was just things like my toolbox going missing and then reappearing broken, or a small pile of leaves being left in front of my wife's office door. We figured it was bored teenagers, maybe even a drunk stumbling home from the speakeasy around the corner. But then things were starting to get weirder. We awoke one morning with the bedroom windows open when we didn't remember opening them the night before. A quick inventory of our belongings showed that nothing had been stolen, but we filed a police report for what was apparently attempted burglary. One night at around 4 a.m., our bedroom lights began wildly turning on and off, waking us up, and stopped just as quickly as it began. We put it down to an electrical fault and made a mental note to call the landlord. But the very next morning, We found the bathroom mirror was shattered, and in the living room, all of the furniture was stacked into a big pile. The night before St. Patrick's Day, I really didn't want to be home alone. Rosa, my wife, had to work late, so unfortunately I didn't really have a choice. We were both on edge at this point from the events of the previous days and nights, and we were constantly snapping at each other for a lack of sleep. Thankfully, I had to work too and was able to get away from the apartment for a few hours. But I dreaded returning home. When I finally did so, Rosa was still at work. I gave her a call to see how she was doing, and she seemed stressed. It was a busy day and she had been forced to take on extra paperwork, but she assured me she'd be done soon, as fast as she could. The moment I walked through the door, I felt like someone was watching me. I also noticed that it was absolutely freezing inside, even though it had been a pretty nice day outside that day. I checked the windows to see if they were inexplicably open again, but they were closed. Then I walked down the hall towards the porch and found the source of the cold. The door to connecting our apartment to the facility was wide open, and a draft was coming in from the dark hallway. I closed the door, concerned with how it had gotten open because we always kept it locked. After Rosa got in from the office, things began to get weirder. She was just as shocked as I was to learn that the door in the porch area was open when I came home, but she had some news for me too. While I was at work, apparently the power had been going on and off all day, despite near-perfect weather. We had ended up purchasing one of those home CCTV systems you can link up to your tablet device. Rosa had been watching a feed of the security cameras and said that he'd seen people walking around the facility who never came through the front gate. As she was telling me all the strange things that happened that day, the door to the facility hallway slammed open. We slowly approached the door to see who had opened it, but no one was there. We locked the door to the hallway again, the house being eerily quiet as we did so. It was then we began to hear a faint sound coming from the storage facility. It sounded like a dozen voices, all talking or singing in unison. Whoever it was, it had to be the same group of people that had been basically terrorizing us for weeks by that point. We decided to confront them, and it might have been the biggest mistake we ever made. We headed over to the storage stage the noises seemed to be coming from, banging on the metal door as loud as I could to gain their attention. Slowly, the door before us opened. There, standing on the table, were 3 short figures with masks on their faces. We couldn't tell if they were kids or grown-ups with dwarfism, but surrounding them were taller, lither figures who also wore masks to conceal their faces. The 3 smaller people on the table were the ones doing the singing, only it sounded a lot more like chanting in some old language now that we were close. As soon as they realized we weren't invited, that we weren't who they were expecting, the chanting stopped, and all masked faces turned towards us. It was only then that we saw a mass of blood and gore on the table in the center of the small figures. I only saw it for a moment before the door slammed shut again, but to this day I've not been able to get that mess out of my mind. I still remember the smell that came from that room, the raw meat smell. It makes me sick to this day. We ran back into our apartment, locking the door behind us and immediately calling the cops. We struggled to relay just what we'd seen, insisting that they had to hurry as we suspected that there were children at risk. But when they arrived, we could no longer hear the chanting sound coming from the storage facility. I was hardly surprised when the cops forced their way inside and found no one present, but what really confused me is that there wasn't a single trace of blood we'd seen. The cops told us that forensics teams combed the facility and couldn't find a single fiber or fingerprint to corroborate our story. Not long after we moved. It was awfully disappointing. We were practically living rent-free in that apartment, but when it came to the horror we'd experienced that night, money was no issue. I'd have paid double what we were paying now just for peace of mind, because I never, ever want to run into those people again. Because another encounter, and I don't think we'll get away so safely. My name is Rosie Lee Williams, and I'm a private investigator based out of Long Island, New York. I spent 20 years with the NYPD's Fugitive Enforcement Division, which is exactly what it sounds like. My job was to track down and arrest those who chose to flee from justice rather than face it. This left me with, as my husband is so fond of phrasing it, a particular set of skills. And although I can't punch like Liam Neeson's Taken character, I'd bet my tracking skills are just as good, if not better. I retired from the department a few years ago after a high-intensity pursuit that left me with a bullet in my shoulder. But for me, the thrill of hunting down fugitives was a vocation, not just a handy career choice, so I used some of our savings to start up a private investigator agency. It was the best decision I've ever made. Alright, following a cheating husband around Manhattan to gather evidence of his infidelities isn't nearly as exciting as hunting down a violent prison escapee, but my word, does it pay better. Having said that, each job is interesting in its own way, but by far the most curious job I'd ever accepted came from County Cork, over in Ireland. I opened up the company email account about this time last year to find a message that seriously piqued my interest. As I may have mentioned, most offers I get are from people in the New York and New England areas, so seeing the mention of Ireland in the body of the message was unexpected, but very welcome. My husband and I are both of Scottish-Irish descent, but have never taken the time to visit the old countries, so I was pretty much sold on the job before I even saw what it consisted of. The message was from a woman who had reported their son missing 5 years before. The Irish police, or Garda as they're locally known, had apparently investigated to the best of their abilities but come up with nothing. She had followed up by hiring a Dublin-based PI, as well as a duo from nearby London, yet still they turned up nothing. And so the grieving mother looked further afield and found me. On the 8th of March 2019, my husband and I boarded a flight out of JFK. 8 hours later, we were landing at Cork Airport. That same weekend, I met up with Mary O'Dwyer. The woman who had sent me the email. Mary and I, along with my husband, met up for dinner at a restaurant in Cork City Centre to discuss the case. Miss O'Dwyer was an incredibly strong woman and had been hardened to grief throughout the span of her time since her son had gone missing. She was open about the fact that her son Patrick had been heavily involved in drug dealing around the whole of Southern Ireland, but didn't believe her son's disappearance was connected to it. She explained that Ireland's violent past had given rise to a kind of code. If someone was killed in relation to criminal activities, it was the custom for the family of said individual to be informed of the reasoning, and on occasion even monetary compensation was provided. No such information had come to light in the aftermath of Patrick's disappearance, yet the previous Garda and PI investigations focused primarily on that possibility. I couldn't understand why. If Patrick was involved in the drug trade, it was definitely the most plausible explanation for his disappearance. But Mrs. O'Dwyer insisted that I talk to one of Patrick's old friends, one that had been consistently overlooked by previous investigators. I soon understood why. Patrick's old friend, who asked not to be named in any of my reports, was not entirely forthcoming with information. This was because his theory on Patrick's disappearance was frankly laughable, and I began to suspect that it was simply a cover-up to deter the police from looking in the right place. I could believe that Patrick had found himself heavily in debt to a Dublin-based cocaine dealer after a shipment had been stolen in transit, but what I couldn't believe was Patrick's friend's theory on what he'd done to pay it off. He actually kept a straight face when he told me that Patrick had gone looking for a leprechaun's pot of gold. You know the story. At the end of the rainbow sits a pot of gold belonging to Ireland's shortest mythical creature. I actually humored him for a few minutes, asking where Patrick might have gone looking for such a prize, and this is where I made my breakthrough. Patrick's friend mentioned a rural area up near the city of Limerick that Patrick had mentioned. This might be the grain of truth I needed, the one masked in a lie which would lead me to uncovering the truth of Patrick's disappearance. In my business, you follow every lead, no matter how unlikely, in the hopes it will be a bridge to which you'll find the truth. I won't bore you with the details of my husband and I's train ride, just know it did not end in disappointment. At the bottom of a cave system on Ireland's west coast, we found a body. A skeleton, to be exact. One with strange growths on the skull. I knew exactly what they were the moment I laid eyes on them. It was bone cancer, the most painful and probably the deadliest of all cancerous growths. DNA testing found it to be Patrick's body, and I was glad to be able to help that poor woman put her son to rest. Now she would be able to properly move on, even if her son's killer wasn't something that could be tried or imprisoned. But although Mary O'Dwyer could now move on from the case, I couldn't put it down so easily. I started to read up on Irish folklore in the hopes that something might shed a little light on the situation. The whole leprechaun story was insane, but Patrick was indeed found at the bottom of a cave system in the area he had told his friend he would be searching. The story was nuts, but the reasoning wasn't. Perhaps there was some kind of code at play, a way the Dublin and Cork dealers could communicate without raising suspicion or alerting police surveillance. That's when I discovered two details that truly frightened me. I read that throughout history, many Irishmen had been hunting for the end of the rainbow in order to unburden a leprechaun of his pot of gold. Each who succeeded found themselves disgustingly wealthy, but such wealth came with a prize. The not-so-lucky Irishman would be cursed with deformities, disease, and eventually death. The second thing that disturbed me was an Irish newspaper article that detailed the arrest and trial of a Dublin drug dealer for murder. It was discovered throughout the course of the trial that the dealer was in fact one of the main backers of a dodgy Dublin hedge fund that provided investment for foreign enterprises. I read that the hedge fund managers were unable to contain their greed at the prospect of a cash injection from wealthy, albeit criminal source, but the method of payment was what keeps me up at night. It was 10 million euros. 10 million paid entirely in rare gold coins. For many of us, Irish folklore conjures up images of fairies, giants, and leprechauns with their huge pots of gold, just wanting to be discovered by those adventurous enough to search for the end of a rainbow. Many such tales and legends were passed from generations to generations, in the very same way we were taught to celebrate important moments such as marriages, deaths, birthdays, and holidays, or even the way we hand down skills such as making weaved baskets or St. Bridget's crosses. All of the above can be considered as a part of Irish folklore, as it is the study and appreciation of how our ancestors lived. But the Irish are also fond of tales that aren't nearly so full of magic and mystery, and there are many tales from Irish folklore designed to send a chill up the spine, instead of putting a smile on the face. So today, in celebration of the festival of St. Patrick, I present to you a handful of traditional Irish ghost stories, as haunting today as when they were first told around campfires on the Emerald Isle. The haunted manor house near the Slaney. On the lush green banks of the River Slaney stands an old manor house called the Boontherig. The family that occupied the manor house in days gone by have long since deserted it, leaving only echoes of the joy and sadness once experienced on the ancient hallowed grounds. And for many a year the hall and pleasure grounds of the palatial residents remained deathly quiet. Yet more than one observant returner from the fairs or markets of the nearby town of Enniscorthy, with vision affected by strong whiskey, were afterwards heard to horrifyingly recall that as they passed the gates, they could see coach after coach whip round the circular walk, drive up to the hall door, where the occupants would gracefully enter the main hall wearing antiquated, luxurious clothing. Through the candlelit first-floor windows, bright figures of men and women would be seen flitting to and fro, but not a single sound could be heard from horses' hooves or coach wheels, nor the dancer or musicians. He was not witnessing a ball of the living, but a dance of the dead. At long last, the Boontherig Manor house was leased to a wealthy farmer from the province of Munster, who, hearing the spectral rumors far too late, made the best of a ghostly situation. The farmer hired a priest from the southern city of Kark to perform a mass in the once celebrated ballroom. When it was done, neither lord nor lady nor musician ever troubled the house again. However, the ghostly visitants had still the privilege of the gravel drive in the semicircle before the hall door on which to perform their eternal ritual of longing for life. A servant girl, employed by the estate's new owner, declared that one night, while off her guard against ghostly tricks, was surprised to see a coach and horses arrive at the manor's front gate. Rushing to perform her duties, she opened the gates to welcome a stately coach onto the ground, assuming it was a similarly wealthy companion of her employer. Yet when she did so, she felt a shiver run through her as she noticed the strange attire of the coachman. He wore old-fashioned clothing, a frilly lace shirt and tri-cornered hat, and made not a sound as he guided his nag down the gravel path. The servant girl made to call out to the driver, but was silenced when he turned, smiled, and showed his face was a little more than a skull, dead flesh barely clinging to old bones. She rushed around to the back entrance in a terrible fright, desperate to warn her employer of the approaching danger. But by the time she did, there was no sign of the coach or its spectral driver, and the servant girl was left to suffer with the frightful image, seeing it in her dreams, every time she slept for many a night to come. The Woman in White. Patrick O'Gill, son of County Kildare, was driving his cart toward Old Dublin City with a load of country produce. Patrick had made a comfy seat for himself on the wagon and had plenty of hay beneath him to make his journey a pleasant one. He was happily occupied with thinking of nothing in particular, all while keeping an eye on his lumbering oxen who steadily labored along hedge-framed country lanes. Patrick found himself at a crossroads near Boreen when he was surprised by the sudden appearance of a woman dressed in long white clothes, crossing the fence and wandering into the road. The woman approached the horse and walked with him a while, close by his neck. Patrick pulled the beast's head to the opposite side for fear he might tread on her feet or long robes, but she still kept as close to him as before. It was only when Patrick thought he could see the lower part of the horse's foreleg through her dress that he realized that the situation had become a grave one. He found his eyes were glued to the shape of the being before him, for he was frozen in terror, while his whole frame covered with cold perspiration born solely from raw fear. In his horror, he was unable to decide on a course of action, but his steed, upon sensing something deeply wrong in the air around it, reared up and plodded on at an increased speed. At the center of the crossroads of Boreen is a patch of green turf, and when they came to its edge, the white figure stood still, yet a portion of the cart seemed to pass right through her without disturbance. Patrick O'Gill, observing this, drew the beast at once to the other side, crying in a voice that quaked with fear. "By your leave, ma'am," he said, hoping a polite disposition might still the being's vengeful spirit. And so on went horse and car, the edges of the load preventing him from seeing the white form. Having advanced 2 or 3 yards, he looked back to see a mangled body on the road behind him. The beautiful woman, whose long, flowing dress has been as white as freshly fallen snow, was now a mess of black and crimson, with blood and dirt plastering her prostrate form. But there was no pained expression on her face, no cries of agony on her lips. She simply looked on towards the terrified Patrick, smiled, and waved the horrified farmer onward. Terrified as he was, he never again took his cart by the way of the Boreen crossroads, having no desire for another encounter with the woman in white. The Haunted House on Bride Street. Mr. Molan, who owned and operated the grocers on Dublin's Bride Street, was left a widower. His dearly departed wife had left him the charge of several young children, and Mr. Molan worked tirelessly to ensure they held on to the quality of life they were accustomed to. But in the months after their mother's death, footsteps began to be heard upstairs, chiefly near to the nursery and always in the middle of the night as the family slept. Great alarm and fright prevailed among the children until the family maid appealed to the master of the house to bring in a man of the church to cleanse the home. Mr. Molan pooh-poohed their fears, yet the maid suspected from his own careworn looks that he also had received disagreeable visits from his late wife. The poor children began to lose the natural cheer of youth and often had looks of fear in their eyes, especially towards night. Little wonder, for steps were constantly heard pacing across the nursery, and sometimes they would awaken to the low sound of breathing and sighing from someone standing beside their beds. But one particular dark night, when the maid was following Mr. Molan upstairs from the cellar, she distinctly saw a small man with a red cap on, following closely behind her master upon the stairs, and holding him by the skirts of his coat. This was the only appearance, and it was the more remarkable as all were of opinion that it was the spirit of the mother, who was showing her anxiety for her daughters from beyond the grave. One evening, the housemaid was sitting at the kitchen table, occupied with drying and drawing out laces and frills. Mr. Molan was sitting on the other side of the room, smoking his pipe and reading over the daily news. The housemaid found herself slowly becoming aware of the presence of her late mistress, pacing close by her in the direction of the fire, and could distinguish the words said in a whisper. "Woe, woe is me." "Master," she said, "did you hear that?" "Hear what, you fool?" he replied impatiently. "My mistress's ghost passing by me and whispering." "It's all imagination," he spoke in a vexed tone. "Don't encourage the children in these nonsensical whims." That night the eldest daughter, who commonly seemed in more terror than her sisters, was sleeping next to the housemaid. A habit she had developed since the ghostly visitations began. She was all at once awakened and became conscious of some awful presence. With a cold perspiration bursting out all over her, she tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. In this state she received 3 severe slaps on the shoulders, causing her to pass out from fright. The father, hearing in the morning what had happened, made up his mind to abandon the house as soon as he could, and in a few weeks was settled in Dorset Street, as far across the city as they could afford. The persecution, or warning, or whatever it was, didn't follow the family to their new residence, and the afflicted home remained abandoned for many, many years. The Ghost of Wicklow County. Lord Kilkevin, whose seat lay in County Wicklow, was an extremely unpleasant master while above ground, and afterwards caused considerable annoyance to his surviving friends and relatives. Not a night passed by without unnatural, frightening noises being heard throughout the manor, doors being flung open, keys heard turning in locks, plates and dishes hurled down from the dresser on the kitchen floor, tables overturned, and chairs flung about. Yet in the morning nothing would be found out of its place. When their nerves were frayed and their sanity tested, the family moved on to another manor house, many miles from the site of their haunted one, but the steward, an old coachman, and a few hangers-on remained behind. Though none suffered more from the ghastly visits of the late master than the coachman, and before long the night came when he would not get a moment's rest. If he attempted to take a nap in the main hall's great chair, he would hear voices whispering dreadful things into his ear, or sometimes he might be awakened in the night to find large purple bruises on his arms and legs. However, there was one peculiarity in his visitations. The departed lord never made himself visible to more than one person in a company, and though he often adopted the appearance of a black dog or a raven, the individual singled out always knew the old lord under his disguises. The wives, sons, and daughters of the neighboring farmers once took it upon themselves to have a ball in the big house, for which they readily got permission. All was as merry as music and drink and an assemblage of young men and women could make it when, in the height of the festivity, the old gentleman took it into his head to become visible in a hideous shape of a huge butchered hog. A woman by the name of Miss Fitzgerald shrieked out and fainted, and the universal mirth and jollity came to an abrupt conclusion. When she was brought to herself and related what occurred, there was a general dispersion, and that was the last attempt at a ball in the big house. The Ghost of the Greg. A lady in the neighborhood of Dublin's Old Town, much celebrated for her many charities, died, and great sorrow was felt for her loss. Many masses were celebrated and many prayers offered up for the repose of her soul, and there was a moral certainty of her salvation among her acquaintances. Yet one evening, after the family had retired to rest, a servant girl in the house, a great favorite with her late mistress, was sitting beside the fire, enjoying the dreamy comfort of a hard-worked person after the day's fatigues, and just before the utter forgetfulness of sleep. Her mind was wandering to her late-loved mistress when she was startled by a sensation in her instep, as if it were trodden upon. "Bad manners to you for a dog," she said, suspecting the collie of the house to be the offender. But to her great terror, when she looked down and around the hearth, she saw no living thing. "Who's that?" she cried out, with the teeth chattering in her head. "It is I," came the ghostly reply, and an image of the dead lady appeared before her, as if as a mist. "Oh, mistress, darling," she said. "What is disturbing you? Can I do anything for you?" "There is something," said the spirit, "and that is why I have appeared to you. Every hour of the day, someone of my family and friends are mourning me. They speak of my goodness, and it is that which is tormenting me in the other world. All my charities were done only for the pleasure of having myself spoken well of, and they are now prolonging my punishment. The only real good I ever did was to give once half a crown to a poor scholar that was studying to be a priest and charging him to say nothing about it. That was the only good act that followed me into the other world. And now you must tell my husband and my children to speak well of my past life no more, or I will haunt you night after night." The next moment the spirit had vanished into thin air, and the poor girl fainted the moment it did so. When she recovered, she hastened into her settled bed and covered herself up, head and all, and cried and sobbed till morning. Everyone wondered the next day to see such a troubled countenance, but she went through her business one way or another, though she could not make up her mind to tell her master what she had seen and heard. She dreaded the quiet hour of rest, and well she might, for the displeased lady visited her again at the same hour and reproached her for her neglect. 3 times she endured the dreaded visits before she made the required revelation, and after that, no more was spoken of the kind lady of the old town, for she was not made comfortable in heaven, only tormented by the fallen one below. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. and join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, you're supposed to sit around with your thumb up ye bum. Joy.